right, Pastor Fred Hinz. Thanks for sitting down with us.
My pleasure.
It's a wild world out there, yeah?
Yes, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and you've got some of the stories I think that people are going to hear today, it's wild. It's almost like it's fiction. The kind of things that are going on in the government, in our culture, in the world around us, and it has deep impacts for the way we raise our families, the way our church operates. Yeah. So very excited to dive into these. Can you just kind of give a little introduction of what you do? Because you have a unique role within the church.
Sure. My title is Public Policy Advocate, and I serve two of the LCMS districts, Minnesota North and Minnesota South, because most of the issues that I deal with are state level issues. And so for the past 10 years now, I have had the pleasure and privilege of being the person who pays attention to public policy matters on behalf of the church. I'm the one that alerts, for example, our district presidents to what's going on, soliciting their input, of course, and allowing them to give direction to our public policy efforts. And then I, in turn, am communicating with legislators, either directly or through a variety of different coalitions that we're a part of. And just as importantly, and perhaps even more important, to communicate back to our pastors and other interested lay members, letting them know what's going on in the state and to a lesser degree, national politics that impacts the church. And so what we've tried to do is be very strategic and disciplined in the way we determine whether we will speak to an issue or not. And as it's played out, basically there are four areas that we will speak to, largely because these areas are what Scripture speaks to and what our church body has spoken to in its official documents. So those four areas are the life issues, which these days includes primarily abortion and physician-assisted suicide, to a lesser degree, surrogacy. Okay. The second area would be that constellation of issues related to marriage, family, sexuality. Third issue would be religious liberty, which is the one that has been exploding here recently. And
you've got an interesting story of something that's going on right now that certainly stateside, Minnesota, but it's going to have national implications.
Yes, absolutely. And then the fourth area is actually a specific form of religious liberty, and that is parental choice in education. Because obviously our church body has always had a significant commitment to education, Christian education. It's one of our hallmarks. And so we want to make sure that our parents are being treated fairly by their government in terms of allowing parents access to the funds that the state collects for all the children, for the education of all the children in the state. So a lot of good things happening there as well.
And I think the importance, what is it, the newsletter you send out? I just want to plug that for people if they want to be to learn more, to be up to date on these things, because I think this is a great resource.
So it's called One Voice for Public Policy. It comes out roughly monthly. It depends on how much activity there is in government on our issues. So if people are interested in receiving that, it comes in email form. They can go to the Minnesota South District website, which is MNS District, all one word, all lowercase, mnsdistrict.org.
And we can put a link. What we'll do is we'll put a link to that. We can probably even put a link straight to the page where
that would be
we can
great.
Put that right in the description below. So if you want to check that out. Because one thing that stands out, the reason this is so important, Neil Hubacher was a good friend of mine back when I lived in New Hampshire, and he worked for a company called Cornerstone. Do you know Cornerstone? They work with family alliance. Is that what it's called here in Minnesota?
Oh, sure.
So they're kind of a counterpart in New Hampshire. And he was a good friend, and he said, so often things happen that are really detrimental just because people don't show up on the kind of conservative Christian side. He said there'd be so many times where there would be a bill that would come up, and the House would want to vote it down, but they would have nobody show up, and they would have about 100 people show up, lay people, citizens from the other side, and one after another they would plead, and the people that wanted to vote this like a bad bill down, they said they just needed one person to show up and to kind of give a case so that they could kind of hang their hat on that. But they said it was really tough to continually just be onslaughted with that. So that was one of their kind of selling points, to where people in the pews need to know what's going on so that they can have some kind of support of it. And that actually gives a lot of power to the decision makers to do the things that we want them to do, right? So everyone listening right now, you do have a role to play in the decisions. You're not just helpless. You can actually do things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't put it better. For a long time, I would say that the Christian community was largely unaware of the changes, very often radical changes that were taking place. We simply didn't have a network set up to get information out in a timely manner. And therefore, you'd have circumstances like the one you just described, where something really bad, some bill that was not good, would be pushed through, and the Christian community would be unaware of it. That was particularly true here in Minnesota last year, with the new DFL trifecta that came into power after the 2022 elections.
The DFL is
Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is the Democrat.
Minnesota, right?
It's unique, yes. So it's the Democratic Party here in Minnesota. But they came in and they had an agenda, and they pushed it with such energy and so quickly that most of us, even persons like myself who pay attention to this stuff, were just completely caught flat-footed, and in some cases were deceived by committee hearings that would take place that would have already taken place by the time I was notified about them.
What kind of things were they pushing through? Can you give some examples?
Well, their highest priority last year had to do with reactions to the Dobbs decision that had occurred back in 2022. And so, for example, their House Bill number 1 was a bill, it's called the PRO Act, Protect Reproductive Options Act. And what it did was to say that abortion was a fundamental right here in Minnesota. Now, you might ask, well, what's a fundamental right? Well, it was not defined in the bill, and that's when bills are particularly dangerous, when you have terms that are introduced that are not defined, because then subsequently any judge can read into it whatever they want. And that's what was passed into Minnesota state statute a little over a year ago. They are trying to do something similar to that this year, except not in state statute, but they want to embed the same kinds of things in the state constitution. So there is going to be a proposal for, they're calling it the new Equal Rights Amendment.
Which sounds so nice, right?
Oh, it sounds very nice. And for most people, they're familiar with an Equal Rights Amendment. It's one that was popular back in the 1970s and 80s. And that was a federal constitutional amendment. in the end, it came close to passing, but it never did. But now they're using that same terminology, equal rights amendment, for a state level constitutional amendment that would declare abortion to be a constitutional right, and beyond that would embed all of the what are commonly thought of as the woke gender identity agenda items, so that trans rights would be embedded in state constitution as well.
So they're kind of putting all of this together.
They're putting it all together in well, actually, we don't have the exact wording yet. The Democratic Party has said that this is coming. They're going to push it, but they have not deigned to let us know what it actually says yet, which is actually a tactic that they've been using recently. They'll put forward a bill, a very vaguely worded bill, as kind of a placeholder, and then immediately meaning perhaps a week before a vote is going to be taken, that's when they actually release the text. And of course, it's too late to mount a significant opposition to it if we find that text is not appropriate.
So is that a new strategy, or is this just old business? Is this how things have always been done, or are they really just going on the affront?
I believe this is a new strategy, and it's one that's taking place in a number of different states around the country. One of this kind of tactic just surfaced in Maine this past week for a rather radical amendment proposal there as well. So it's this kind of playing with the process, manipulating the process, that has allowed the progressive element to actually gain a lot more ground than they otherwise would have had the normal process and timing been maintained. But
so they know the things that they're pushing would not live up to scrutiny with public opinion.
Yes.
And if you really just wanted to have cool heads prevail, they're not going to be able to push these things through. And so they know they have to go about these kind of this cheating and these shortcuts and this alternative ways of going about it in order to get their agenda through.
That's exactly right. It is very much analogous to what was going on in the as all the voting procedures were changed back in 2020.
Yeah.
So abruptly, and opening up to a wide variety of really fraud-friendly changes in our voting procedures. The same thing is happening in the procedures within legislatures.
So you mentioned abortion rights being part of the state constitution. Is that right? That's
it would be.
And also trans rights. What are the abortion rights? How is that worded? What kind of implications would that have for us living in Minnesota?
Well, any of the incremental changes that we had passed in over the last several decades, really, a woman's right to know, waiting periods, parental notification, all those kinds of things, all of those would be off the table because they would be then construed as limiting a constitutional right, which the courts generally say you can't do that.
So the goal from our side would be, we at least want like an ultrasound, at least sit on this for a couple weeks. We had Dr. Donna Harrison on, and she said that, what was it? I think it was the normal abortion happens within a week of someone finding out, and the decision is made like within 2 days, right? And the argument is well, not the argument. The data shows that if a person simply waits a week or two, they change their mind. Which, why in the world would we want to rush someone into a decision that we know statistically they're going to regret in 2 weeks? So that's something that's been a push. If my 14-year-old daughter gets pregnant, the idea is that I, as a parent, should know so I can be part of the decision-making process. So these are things that have been brought in. They want to undo these, is what you're saying?
Absolutely. In fact, right now, there is a bill before our Minnesota State Legislature, which essentially says that that children, regardless of age, are the ones in charge of their own health care. That doesn't matter if we're talking about a child of 15 years of age, of 5 years, or even younger than that. It stipulates that they, not parents, are the ones to call the shots. Parents don't need to be notified. Parents will not necessarily have any input into these decisions. And of course, that is particularly concerning when the public schools in particular have shown such an affinity for taking over the role of parents. When if a child would express some kind of concern about their body, whether they are the sex that their body says they are, very, very often, of course, schools now have policies in which they clearly indicate that parents are not to be informed of that. And so a constitutional amendment that would guarantee those rights, and then complementary statutory laws that reinforce that as well, it simply shows the great antipathy that our progressive elements of government have for parents in general, for the nuclear family. And so again, it's not just here in Minnesota. You'll find it in many of the other progressive states as well. And it's very frightening.
It's insanity.
It is complete insanity. And it is so radical that most people can't even believe that it's true. And I understand that. It is really beyond the pale. The former notion that parents are the primary authority in the life of their child, that is completely set aside and contradicted outright. And so the government frequently through its schools is trying to claim that right for themselves.
Yeah, we had a friend that's a teacher in Massachusetts, right? So there's another quite progressive state. So this would have been maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and she was a high school teacher and very, very sharp woman. But she said she had numerous students who would be dropped off. Sam would be dropped off, or I think it was usually the opposite direction. So it would usually be,
Samantha.
Sherry. Yeah, Samantha was dropped off. And then they would go to the teachers, and they told the teachers, you need to call me Sam or Steve because I'm a boy. And the parents had no idea. So they're dropping their kids off. I mean, there might be some warning signs at home, but the kids have never told the parents that they're identifying now as a boy. But all the teachers know. And legally, she was not allowed to tell the parents.
No.
And it really bound her conscience. She wasn't really sure what to do. As her pastor, she would talk about it. But the line she felt she could draw legally was she would refuse to call the child by anything but the legal name unless the parents told her. And that was kind of like her one little sweet spot. But she was not allowed to tell the parents. So these parents are sending the kids off. There's other adults in the room that know that there's something very serious going on. And the parents by law are being omitted from this. Like, that is diabolical.
And frequently in those schools they will actually have a closet full of clothes where the student is allowed to change into the clothing of the opposite sex, and then change back again before they go home. So it's clearly aided and abetted by the school. And of course, very quickly you get into these pronoun issues. Most teachers that have concerns about this, their greater concern is that they don't want to be forced to use inappropriate pronouns. Names, personal names are, there are a lot of names, frankly, that you don't know if it's a boy or a girl, just from the name. But pronouns is a different story entirely. And so more frequently, it is this forced usage of inappropriate pronouns that is causing teachers to leave the profession, or at least to leave public education.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them now are starting to find their way to our schools and asking, "Is there a place for me in your schools?"
Yeah.
And sometimes there is, because our enrollments are growing significantly. The level of parental concern is very high, and therefore many people wanting to get into our schools if they have room. So in the end, the spin-off effects of all these are considerable. It produces a huge shortcoming or shortage of teachers in general, because of course a significant number of them leave the teaching profession entirely. And so public education is scrambling because they're losing a lot of teachers, in particular, more mature teachers that understand the degree of change that is being imposed on the system. And of course, the teachers that are coming in then are the new ones. And frequently they have been indoctrinated into the woke gender identity view of the world. And which simply aggravates the whole situation, because then parents eventually find out and they're not willing to subject their kids to that.
I really hope that, I think this is one of the things we need. This is one of the things that you're fighting for, but for Christians to understand that picture you just painted, that's a war, right? So this kind of Christian soldier aspect, to where that's two things. One, that's insane, right? And you don't want insanity in your back door. Insanity, it's going to creep into your house eventually. And second, there's an opportunity there, which I know, we talked before this. You're an optimist. I'm an optimist by nature. That's right. Some of the listeners might say, how can you be optimist with that and some other things you're going to talk about? But our school is growing 30% year over year, right? People are fleeing that, both teachers and certainly parents that are aware and have the means to pull their kids out of the public school system. They're trying to do so. And if you just want to, just from a purely business standpoint, if you want to be successful, wave the flag as high as you can to say, we're not that. No. We're not that. Because a lot of the people that come in, they're saying, we don't want that. I don't know if we're fully yet on board with Orthodox Christianity, right? Lowercase o. But we know we have to at least give you a try. And a lot of those people they're coming into the school, and a year later they come into the church. That's our greatest outreach right now. First thing you need to know, we're not insane. Second, let me tell you why we're not insane.
And what we're finding is when they come to us, they do have a lot of questions.
Yeah, good questions.
And appropriately so. But as they experience life within a Christian worldview, which is what our congregations and schools are, they are finding that this is refreshing, and they stay. We retain the large percentage of people that give us a try. So now the issue is quickly becoming, do we have enough space for the number of people? And increasingly, we find that we're full. So then that's a challenge to the congregations and schools. At what point do you start to talk about adding brick and mortar capacity to the schools? Who funds those expansions? Where do you find the staff to man those new classrooms? And not just any staff, but staff who understand why our schools exist to begin with. What the Christian ethos is that we are so passionate about. That takes time to develop, especially in people that haven't experienced it themselves.
Yeah. If I can just do two quick plugs. One, for those listening, we have people listening from a lot of different churches, throughout the country. This is at least a good idea for your church to explore. There's a lot of schools that are opening, a lot of new ones, and a lot of ones that are really rooting themselves in a fully Christian worldview. And there's a couple different approaches to that. We had Christian Preuss on, he talked about one aspect that's really exploding, but that is a great avenue that I think that we need to revisit, because we had kind of a growth of Christian schools in our Lutheran heritage. And then they've kind of been slowly dying until just recently. And to the point earlier, the last 4 or 5 years, we're growing at 30%. That was not the case 10 years ago, but the demand is there. So I think that's important. Second, I want to just take the opportunity to just do a plug for one of our sponsors, and that is LCEF. So you mentioned, we might have to explore things like brick and mortar options, right? So taking out a loan and building something. And we have a great resource for that for churches to look into, and that's the Lutheran Church Extension Fund. And we did a building project at my previous church. We've done some here. And LCEF they give loans to churches. They want to work with churches to help expand the gospel. And they do it in a great way that is geared towards the Lutheran Church. I
can give you a personal testimonial to that. So I serve at a Lutheran church and school here in Minnesota, and we built a school building. It's about 10 years ago now, but that happened because of LCEF. They provided not only the funding for that, but some of the expertise and the guidance to help a congregation work through the various phases of a capital campaign, and even deciding, is this the right thing to make this kind of an investment? They were extremely helpful. There.
Yeah, and they've been helpful with this podcast as well. So they're very mission oriented. They want the gospel message to get out, and and if you're just a lay person, how do you get involved? You can open a savings account, banknotes. So they've got a couple different things that you can do, and basically they're worth checking out. We'll have a link below, but they support this podcast, and they do a lot for the church to allow some of these I think growth opportunities that we have. So,
amen.
Yeah, amen. Well tied in, but I do want to circle back. I just want to say, so you've got some more, kind of shake you by your collar type cases to say this stuff's going on. Why in the world are they trying to push this? Just the things you've talked about, my 14-year-old daughter's pregnant and I as a parent don't have a right to know. My middle schooler, my 8th grader goes into school and is identifying as someone of the opposite sex, and I don't have the right to know. That's insanity. Everyone thinks it's insane. Why are they pushing it? Why is there so much money and backing behind this? What's the motivation?
Yeah. Well, the motivation is ultimately to have government control of everything in the public school system. Of course, that is the government. And so, as has always been the case with progressive folks and people that want the government to be everything in our culture, one of the ways you do that is to make sure that first of all, that parents don't have a choice. Right now, in many states, if you don't have the financial means to choose something other than your local public school, you're locked in. You're a captive audience, and when you're a captive audience, you have no voice. Frequently, when we're talking about parental choice, we say, when you have a choice, you have a voice. And that is exactly the way it works. Which is, among other things, is why I'm so excited about these new efforts in states across the country to give parents access to the dollars that the state allocates for their child. The mechanism to do that is called an education savings account.
Okay.
And there are currently now 14 states that have these kinds of mechanisms available. In fact, just two additional ones this past week, Alabama and Wyoming were added to that list. But what that does is to simply give, as I said, parents access to the dollars that the state has allocated them. The parents become the purchasers of educational services for their children. Typically, that would mean paying tuition at a some other kind of school, a religious school it could be, or some kind of private school.
Yeah.
And then that school becomes accountable to the parent because they are the one that pays the bill.
Yeah.
Those education savings accounts then frequently the number of dollars that the state allocates. So, for example, down in Iowa, they're in their first year of an education savings account program.
Yeah, yeah.
So for every child, the parents receive $7,000 every year. And with that, then the state, as I said, they pay tuition at a school. But typically, the tuition is not that high. Most schools, you could probably pay tuition $4,000 perhaps. So there are additional dollars that are available for other kinds of education expenses.
Oh, wow.
Might be music lessons, could be a wide variety of things. But even there, they typically have money left over. So then the question becomes, well, what happens to those dollars that are not used? Well, in virtually all the education savings accounts, the programs, they roll forward. Any unused funds roll forward from year to year, so that by the time you get to the end of your 12th grade, your high school education, whatever accumulated funds there are then become available for post-secondary education, whether that's trade school or college or whatever. And it has not cost the state one dime more than it would have had they attended a public school.
Wow.
All of those years.
So it's a more efficient and effective way of allocating money.
It's much more efficient. And really the biggest advantage is that it puts the parent in charge.
Yeah.
The school is accountable to the parent. And one of the things that few people seem to appreciate yet is that even if the parent has not requested to be part of this of an ESA program, just the fact that public school officials know that those parents could have access to those funds makes the public school officials much more responsive to the concerns of their parents. So you improve education, not just among those who make a change, let's say go from public education to let's say a Lutheran school, but also those that remain in public education have a better education system because that system is accountable to parents.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win for all parents, regardless of whether you ultimately decide to switch schools with your child or remain in the same school. The same public school
has to compete for your business.
They have to compete. It's the same magic that competition works in every other area of life.
Yeah.
When you have to compete, it drives excellence, and it improves efficiency.
Yeah. So once again, that's beautiful. Didn't you say something like 80% of people support that?
The polling really for the last 20 years already has shown very large percentages of people favoring this kind of funding mechanism, the one that puts parents in control. The most recent polling shows at least 80% of the general populace supports this.
You can't get the population to agree 80% on anything.
No, you couldn't get 80% to agree that the sky is blue or the grass is green.
Yeah.
And that includes 65% of Democrat voters, 75% of independent voters, and then higher percentages of Republican voters. So the public is behind this in a big way. We don't have it yet, at least here in the state of Minnesota, largely because of the influence of the teachers' unions. Their lobbying capacity is daunting.
Yeah.
They employ large numbers of lobbyists, and their interests do not serve the interests of parents or families. They serve the interests of the unions themselves. They don't even serve the interests of teachers because teachers have not fared well. Public school teachers have not fared well under the influence of the unions.
Yeah.
So, again, there are good things happening. We now have 14 states that do have education savings accounts. The closest one to us being Iowa. Wisconsin has a different form of school choice. Theirs is more of a voucher program.
Okay.
But it's been around for 25 years and has been very successful. Parents like it. So there's reason to be optimistic.
Yeah.
And
good opportunities for forward progress.
Yeah. Eventually, even states like Minnesota will see that we have to go this direction for the sake of the children.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are the things that are going on that we should have our eyes on?
Well, probably the biggest thing that has happened recently occurred about 2 weeks ago. Need to give you a little background information. Last year in our legislative session, that's the first session again where the Democrats had control both of the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. They passed a number of really radical bills. One of them was a change to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. The Minnesota Human Rights Act was passed in 1993, so it's about 30 years old. It was an act that sought to bring a balance between the rights of people not to be discriminated against unjustly, and it includes a listing of people who had been suffered from discrimination in the past. So you probably remember the old litany of race, color, creed, religion. Well, last year the Democrats added an additional group, an additional protected group, and that group was gender identity. So being translated, folks who suffer either from sexual gender dysphoria, people who view themselves as born in the wrong body, that kind of thing. So all of the other protected classes in the Minnesota Human Rights Act for these past 30 years, there has always been an exception, a religious exemption built in, which essentially said, state, you may not come and force churches or church schools to adopt your view of discrimination. So last year, when this new protected class was added, there was no protection. There was no exemption added for that to correspond to that. So that meant that church schools would be open to lawsuits based on discrimination by gender identity.
Okay.
And this is the first time that religious entities had been open to that kind of legal attack.
So would that mean that if our school was looking to hire, say, a teacher or someone like at the front desk, as the kids are coming in, and if someone were to apply for that, and let's say they were a transgender or they were a guy identifying as a girl, something like that, that the church /school would not be able to say that goes against our belief system and therefore we can't hire you for this position. Is that right? This law would mean that we would not be able to make that stance.
That is basically correct. That would certainly be true of a teacher in the classroom. The more the employee would be expected to embody the mission and ministry of the school,
Yeah.
That would be the most concerning thing.
Yeah.
A custodian, maybe not quite so much.
Yeah.
But certainly in those that carry the mission forward.
Yeah.
Day to day. So what happened then was that most people assumed that the accompanying exemption was not included, and that was simply an oversight. That in the past, whenever a new protected group had been added, there had also been an exemption added for that group. Mm-hmm. So we approached the Democratic leadership of the House and the Senate and said, we think you've made an oversight here. There's a fairly easy fix to this. All you have to do is, in that list of exemptions, you simply add the words "and gender identity," so that it too would fall under this exclusion or exemption.
And did they say oops?
They did not say oops. In fact, in a committee hearing, that they were very clear, where some of the legislators said for the first time, no, we were very much aware of the language and the impact of the language. And so when we came with an amendment to correct what we thought was an oversight, mm-hmm. We were greeted with some rather, what is the right word? Hostile legislators.
Yeah.
So I was one of 4 testifiers in which we came and asked the committee to please back this amendment so that the exemption would be restored mm-hmm. to the way it had been for the last 30 years. But the reaction was explosive. We were told in no uncertain terms that our viewpoints were medieval and antiquated and just plain hateful. Mm-hmm. And so even though we believe we made a very common sense proposal to maintain this delicate balance that had existed for 30 years, mm-hmm. So that people who needed protection, needed their rights protected, would be, but the church would not be forced to violate its conscience, mm-hmm. or people in the church. That delicate balance was destroyed a year ago, and they were unwilling to do what it takes to restore that balance.
Yeah. And I mean, just for like the here, just to see how practical this is, right? So to your point, a janitor, you can have a discussion about something like that, right? As far as what that would look like if at Trinity Lutheran Church and School, if a janitor was having a, different gender identity or something like that.
Right.
But the people that spend money, discounted money, but spend money and send their children into the 3rd grade classroom are expecting that 3rd grade teacher is a proper representative of what the Lutheran Church and the Christian Church believe and confess, so that the unity comes throughout what pastor's saying on Sunday to what the teacher's saying on the 3rd grade teacher saying, and then the parents. And to plug in somebody who overtly, not even just with a little bit of confusion, but overtly says, there's big parts of what you believe, church and school, that I disagree with, and I'm going to embody and to teach something contrary, that is extraordinarily damaging, certainly from a perspective from a Christian, but just for the institutional integrity, that's extraordinarily damaging. And they don't see that.
That's right? That's exactly right. And it's very appropriate that you should use the word embodied, mm-hmm. because in this case, it is literally the presentation of your body mm-hmm. that speaks volumes as to whether or not you subscribe to a biblical worldview or not. Mm-hmm. And so even aside from what words might be spoken, the simple physical presentation mm-hmm. is meaningful as well. But as it stands right now, the Democratic leadership of the House and the Senate and the governor, he's been involved in these talks as well, have been unwilling to make this change, to simply reinstitute the mutual respect that had existed before, to reestablish this delicate balance. They've not been unwilling to do that. In response to that, that hearing was recorded. That recording has been viewed by, I'm sure, many thousands of people here in the state of Minnesota, and I'm sure beyond as well. And they had a chance to see very up close and personal what a clash between a Christian worldview and a progressive atheist worldview looks like, because it was on full display in that hearing. And I think it was very shocking to people to see what that looks like and what it sounds like. And so while it was not pleasant that day, I'll tell you, in the end, it was probably a helpful thing. Yeah. Because it sets in front of everybody the real state of our culture. Yeah. They said the quiet part out loud. They did. The masks came off. That was one of the images that they used. And indeed, they did. It was a full-blown attack on Christians and the Christian worldview. Yeah. And I think that's important. I think the battle that we've had over the last 20 years has been more so. And actually, I do think my generation kind of sees this instinctually, because we were molded in it in our college years, and it was already kind of prevalent. But there was this long period of time where there was this assumption that the normal American culture and certainly like the government, those kind of leading from the government side and such, we thought we were kind of the same, like almost like brother and sister between church and the state. And when we lived underneath that, we were kind of like a frog in the boiling pot, right? And it was just slowly getting worse, but we didn't know how to put our finger on it. And that resulted in, I think, Christians that were just kind of, I don't know if lazy is the right word. They were like, sleepy. Sleepy. Sloth would be, maybe the most formal word. Yeah. And that kind of took over to where it does take these kind of things to bring back to kind of that war imagery, to say, no. Like this is what it was like when you had a pagan Europe and Christianity coming out, and they were so polarized that there was only one could stand in the end. Right. And exactly. If we don't have that mentality, I hope we're waking up to that mentality. And I hope things like this show you, no, we're not on the same team as the public school system right now. Yeah. And that the use of the term pagan is exactly correct. In the end, we are experiencing a re-paganizing of our culture. One of the ways of demonstrating that, in the past, when the change happened, when we went from a pagan culture to a Christian culture back, several millennia ago, one of the things that entailed was to change both the viewpoint of time and space. So, for example, the calendar, the pagan calendar that had existed prior to Christianity, the rise of Christianity, that calendar was largely transformed into a Christian calendar. So time itself was rethought and revisioned. The same thing was true of space. The pagan temples became Christian congregate churches. Yeah. Well, what we're experiencing now is the exact reverse of this. So, for example, you're well aware of the fact that every June, a whole month now is set aside to a new pagan god. Yeah. And they're actually talking about making it 2 months now. And other parts of the calendar as well are being de-Christianized. We're familiar with how that goes around the holidays and so forth. But also our spaces are also being repaganized. You may be aware of what happened in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York.
No.
Just 3 weeks ago. I'm not sure if I should call her a woman or a man, but a transgender person who had previously been a prostitute. Died, and their family and the LGBT community managed to convince the people that supervise the cathedral to allow this funeral for this person, and it turned into a complete debacle, just complete desecration of.
You can give some examples if you want to give.
Well, I'm hesitant to. It's actually.
It was not PG
shocking.
Rated, is what you're saying.
No, it's not PG.
And this was taking place inside St. Patrick's.
Inside St. Patrick's. And for the most part, it seems as though at least the leadership of the diocese there.
Was this Catholic?
Catholic,
okay,
yes.
So
Roman
so
Catholic.
They're not on board with any of this.
They're not on board, though there is some speculation that there had to be some people within the diocese that were aware of what was being planned. But for our purposes here, what we're talking about is the sacrilege of a holy space, a Christian space. And so that kind of thing is happening all over. And so in that sense, what we're experiencing is a repaganizing of the culture. And we can expect this kind of thing to happen with increasing frequency. It happened at the state capitol, as I said, about 2 weeks ago, where there was a very obvious clash between a Christian worldview and a pagan atheistic worldview. And it's happening frequently as in other areas. So, for example, here in Minnesota, last year, our legislature essentially declared us to be a transgender sanctuary state. So what that means is, even though many of the states that surround Minnesota now have laws which would make it illegal for minors to undergo either hormonal or surgical transition.
I think the whole UK just did that. I think they just banned that.
They just got rid of it. That's right. That's right. But here in Minnesota, we've moved in just the opposite direction, so that according to the legislation that was passed last year, if that child sets foot in the state of Minnesota physically, the state of Minnesota, and I should say the child claims some kind of sexual or gender dysphoria. They want to have access to transitioning services. The state now will step in and provide those services, and if the parent objects, the state will take temporary legal custody of the child, remove it essentially from the parent who's out of state,
who's in
somewhere,
Indiana or Michigan, some other state.
South Dakota, wherever. And so the state then is, first of all, they're interfering in the legal rights of other states. And we're saying that we will essentially act as the parent and provide those kinds of transitioning services, and then presumably send them back to their real parents, and have to deal with the fallout of that, which we now know can be catastrophic in a physical sense as well as psychiatric sense.
That's insane.
It's absolutely insane. And other states are following in this. Right now, Maine is undergoing a major...
This is the bill you were talking about earlier?
Yes.
Yeah.
We also have another bill in Minnesota right now, and I may have mentioned this earlier, where we declare children capable of directing their own health care. no matter what their age, without the input of parents. It is a consistent theme where parents are being excluded from any meaningful impact on their child's life, which is completely it's unconstitutional.
Yeah,
it's in violation of many different state statutes, but it's being done nonetheless.
So, wow. In some ways, I don't even know what to say, but I mean, just with one, I mean, so Minnesota, and not just Minnesota, but these few people in Minnesota that have obviously just lost their mind. I don't know how else to put it. Like, there's no positive spin of like, well, in love of neighbor, they're trying to do like they've lost their mind. But not only are they now setting up a system in Minnesota, but they're actually sabotaging the other states that have made just sensible decisions. Yeah. So that now Indiana can try to protect its own by saying, that's insane, but we're not going to do so. Our people have spoken. They've elected these people that are going to make sure that doesn't take place. And Minnesota says, basically, screw you guys. Send your kids over here. We'll mutilate them and send them back to you.
That's right. And so, not surprisingly, other states, those that are having their rights violated, just last week, I believe it was, 16 different states attorney general from red states sent a letter to Maine, the state of Maine, saying, you are playing with fire here, because if you trample on our rights this way, you can expect to receive that kind of treatment in return. And what we're toying with here is literally a civil war of sorts.
Yeah,
that the country will not be able to maintain any meaningful sense of unity if you persist in advancing these kinds of measures. We're not in Kansas anymore. It's I'll just give you one more example. Illinois, this current legislative session has a bill in front of it which would change the definition of child abuse, so that the new definition would include anybody who failed to actively support a child acquiring an abortion, or who failed to actively support the gender transitioning of a child. Like, for example, a parent might not want their child to have an abortion. The parent might not want their child to undergo either chemical or surgical transition. If the parent did that, they would now be defined as a child abuser. They would very likely have custody of the child removed. They would be open to both fine and or prison. That is currently before the legislature in Illinois, and could easily be in front of our legislature next year.
Bennett, what's the word that's one up from insane? I'm drawing a blank. I don't think you can use it.
It has gone beyond the ability
buffoonery. I mean, I don't know what the right word is. This isn't.
It is so preposterous.
Yeah.
So having taken leave of reality, that it is hard to find words to describe it, to the point where most people would find it difficult to even accept that this is really happening.
Yeah.
How could anybody be that immoral, amoral, but yet it is happening, and now we have so many examples piling up one on top of another that it is time for people to recognize just the degree of revolution. It is nothing short of a revolution that is currently taking place. And as long as the vast majority of normal people are unaware of this, they are being successful. They have grabbed a hold of the levers of power, largely in government, but also in industry, in education, in law. They've been very strategic at this. They've been working at it for decades.
Yeah.
All the professional associations, American Medical Association, American Psychiatric Association, all of them are largely controlled by progressive activists. And they purport then to speak for all of these professionals, when in fact they are only speaking for only a thin sliver of people in that field. But they use that to essentially propagandize our legislators. And, let's say, well, look, doctors are in favor of this. Psychiatrists are in favor of this. Well, that's not true. It's these professional organizations that purport to speak for everyone.
It's how a small number of people can successfully control a large number of people that would disagree with them. It's the only way you can go about it.
Exactly.
Back to the way they railroad these things through. It's not this idea of, we've got a couple good ideas here and they're going to debate, and we're going to land on one side. We know our idea is not going to be passed through. It's not, to go back, I mean, it's not those old red-blue divides where you have a similar goal of a healthy, thriving society that's rooted in some kind of objective goodness that everyone can see. And we've got different ideas of how to get there with kind of varying degrees of good and bad.
Yes.
But now it's just, there's a group of people that have a goal of what most people would say looks hellish.
Yes.
And there's a large number of people that have a view of some degree of good and virtue. And the small number is winning. And this is where I think the most important point for those listening is these stories should just grab you by your collar and shake you. But we are perpetually in this weird place, and I hope we're coming out of it, where one side is actively waging war and attacking, and the other side is pretending as if it's not happening. And we constantly hide underneath this idea of this like weird separation of church and state, where the idea is like, well, we're Christians, so we need to talk about Christ forgiving you, which you certainly should talk about. But then somehow we're not supposed to talk about these things. And all you're doing there is you're setting up people in your communities, maybe even your own family, to end up falling prey to these demonic type practices. And if we don't stand against these things, the kid down the street who's got divorced parents, the kid's going to have a mutilation surgery at the age of 14, or the parents are going to lose their child. And even if you're not in Minnesota, if you're in Indiana, they can travel to Minnesota and do this, or we're going to have a civil war and, a generation's going to die. Those types of things the church should be concerned about, because we care about the well-being of people, both their souls and their physical life and the structure of family.
Absolutely.
And these things are under a brutal attack. And most people say, ooh, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. The degree of suffering that is already occurring because of these progressive ideas that are infiltrating. Really, many of them are Marxist.
Yep.
Socialist at best, but usually cross over into Marxism. They are already producing a huge degree of suffering. We see it especially in our young people. Their mental health has deteriorated significantly. You see large increases in suicide or self-harm of various kinds. But it extends into older demographics as well. You see large numbers of deaths of despair, as they're called, drugs overdoses and the like. It's all running rampant in our culture, and they can be traced back most frequently to the deterioration of the family and the deterioration or the lack of participation in the church.
Yeah.
Because people now carry with them a largely evolutionary frame of mind, which says that I am not a created being, as we Christians would claim and can prove, but I am an evolved being. I'm an accident. There is no inherent structure or order in the world that I need to conform to and that can give my life boundaries and definition. I'm on my own. And it turns out that is a very heavy burden to carry, too heavy for many people. And so as all of these political measures serve to undermine, circumvent the family, undermine the church, what we're going to see are even more increases in suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, as you said, are what we Christians in our baptismal calling
Mm-hmm.
are called to address. We are here to not only bring the gospel, the word of God's love for us in Christ, but we're here to prevent the kind of suffering that invariably follows in a paganized culture.
Yeah. So I wonder if this has always been the case or if we've just lost this, but it seems like one of the chief issues is that goes along with this. I don't know if I say chief anymore because you just laid out, all these slew of issues, but it almost seems like we don't even have unity within the church of being able to say, we all don't agree with that, right? Like we're kind of scared to even kind of put that burden of confession on our people to where we're just kind of okay with, well, whatever you guys think about these things, as long as we all say Jesus is Lord, but we don't define what that means, then we're okay. But like you need the church to be fully united on saying we don't agree with that, and we have to all be united on that. That's kind of essential. And I can't necessarily say it has to rise to like a creedal level, but it certainly has to be pretty close below that, because you have to have some kind of united, not just institution in the secular sense, but like the church should be the one united earthly institution. It's a heavenly institution, but the way it manifests here on earth, it should be united to confront overt evil. And if you don't have that, you run into, you allow and you empower evil to do what it's doing.
Yeah. Even when the church doesn't outright advocate for these kinds of evils, when the church becomes ambiguous,
yep,
that is perhaps even a more dangerous circumstance. And unfortunately, it's the kind of thing we see developing in our Christian friends and neighbors in the Roman Catholic Church. The current Pope, of course, is notoriously ambiguous in many of his statements, particularly as they apply to these moral, social issues. And what it has produced in the Catholic Church is a huge degree of turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
The Pope seems to be attacking Catholics that have a traditional view, who want to worship in a traditional view, frequently using the Latin Mass.
Yeah,
he actively opposes that. He frequently speaks about traditional Catholics as being dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this is causing a great deal of upset within Roman Catholicism. It's the same kind of upset that has gone on in Protestant circles over the last 40 or 50 years. But now for us to see it in the Roman Catholic Church, which has always been the kind of the bulwark of traditional, a traditional view of the world.
Yep.
That is disturbing to me as a Lutheran Christian. I think just as much as it is disturbing to Catholics themselves.
Yeah, we don't want them to fall.
No, we all count on a pontiff, a pope, that can retain basic Christian teachings and not waver from that.
Here's where we talked about this a little bit beforehand. Before we started recording, but with our optimism, and what I see in the Catholic circles is the Pope's doing what he's doing, and it's empowering some of, especially like in Germany and stuff like that, where there's real strong trends of liberalism, both in our own Lutheran or Protestant church, and certainly in the Catholic Church. But there's, I think, a revival rising up in the Catholic Church, because I see this in my friends who are people that probably went to Catholic Mass once a month kind of a thing growing up. And all of a sudden they're following channels like this on the Catholic side, Pines with Aquinas we talked about earlier, Bishop Barron, Father Mike, some of these different ones that are very conservative, and they're becoming very rejuvenated in their Catholic understanding, dedicated. And they're picking a side, and it's not the side of the Pope. Yes. And Matt Fradd, who's the host of Pints with Aquinas, posted something not that long ago where he said, or he said, we've got I was talking with a marketing company, and they said the Catholic Church has about 100 channels with over 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. So they've done very well in this media space. It's really impressive. And Matt Fred said, can someone find me one channel with over 100,000 subscribers of someone that's promoting anything but like very conservative? If anyone that's, he said specifically, anyone that's supporting any push for women ordination, any kind of change of an understanding of gender or homosexuality. And the kicker was they couldn't find any.
There's no energy there.
There's no energy. So once again, it's this small minority that has some kind of power, Pope Francis, for instance. Yeah. And then there's this large conglomerate of dedicated Catholics that aren't buying that. And they're actually, I think, becoming strengthened in their opposition to that small bit of insanity that's creeping in. And that's where I hope the same trends happen in the LCMS. Yes. I really hope, because there's bits and pieces of it that flow in with us. And then, of course, there's some of the other synods that have kind of...
Well, I can verify that. I mean, in this public policy space that I operate in, the degree of collegiality and friendship that exists between the Roman Catholic traditional folks and us it's wonderful. It's refreshing. Obviously, there are theological issues that still that divide us, but we're honest about those first of all. But then we also look to these other cultural issues in which we see with exactly the same viewpoint. We are synoptic, to use a churchy term. We're synoptic when it comes to cultural matters, because we essentially derive our view of the world from Scripture, and that's a wonderful thing. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Lutherans defined themselves in contrast to Catholics. I'm a Lutheran because I don't cross myself, or whatever.
Don't have a crucifix, or, something like that.
Thankfully, we've left those days, I think, behind, and we have found a new degree of again, collegiality and mutual support. There no doubt will be a time when we'll want to sit down and talk about some of the theological issues. But when that time comes, I believe we will be able to do so on a much more basis of friendship and trust than would have been true 50 years ago.
Yeah, amen to that. I think that's something that I would very much like to see. Mostly just because I've got friends and different degrees of theologians that are in different circles outside of the LCMS, and just anecdotally, it's overwhelming to where I can talk with a Catholic and we can dive down a rabbit hole and we can be on par with most things. And once again, I'm not saying, to your point, we do have theological differences, but I find it much more difficult when I come to more like liberal Protestantism or kind of any of those fields. I feel like there's a deeper divide. We don't have the same language. We don't have some of the same foundational beliefs, some of the same ways of looking at history and what are the anchors of the church. And I think that's what certainly led a lot of people to fall prey to some of these things you're seeing in the political sphere, right? Where you can have more than half of the Lutherans in the Western world are supportive to pretty high degrees of these crazy things that you're talking about. And that's insane, right? That's insanity that's crept into the Lutheran name. And that's a serious issue to where, to your point, usually if you go to the Catholic, they see that that's also insane. You can commiserate on that aspect, and they see that, some of the same trends in their own field as well.
Yeah, the breadth of the spectrum within a single church body, for example, within the Catholic Church or within Lutheranism, seems to be much broader than the spectrum between Orthodox people across the denominational spectrum. And I, for one, find that refreshing. I believe that Lutherans have something to bring to the ecumenical table, but I'm also learning that there are that other denominations have things to bring, gifts to bring to the ecumenical community. And so that's a good thing.
Yes, it is.
But in the short term, we have these threats. Most of them posed by the weaponizing of government. So the government, they have coercive powers that nobody else has. The government has people that run around with guns that nobody else has.
Yeah.
And so if you succeed in capturing the government, in converting them into your religious view, which is what wokeism is, progressivism, radical progressivism. If you can get government to subscribe to that, you have a powerful tool that you can use to coerce others, and we're beginning to feel that.
Yeah. So, Fred, you got a couple more cases, I guess you could say, or issues that are going on that I think are important, and then then we can talk about what can we do about these. So, yeah, go ahead. What's some of these?
Well, one of the more I hesitate to call it shocking anymore because
after this last hour,
but there's been a case that has surfaced here recently, in which it's becoming clear the degree to which Christians are being relegated to second-class status in the culture. It takes place in Missouri. It turns out there is a court case that's currently being litigated. It happens to involve a lesbian woman who has filed suit against the state of Missouri. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that the judge in that case has declared that presumptively that we must assume that any Christian that holds a traditional view of morals will be deemed to be unfit to serve on that jury. So now it turns out that, as was predicted by Supreme Court Justice Alito back in 2015, when the court passed its Obergefell ruling, which legalized same-sex marriage, the dissenters in that opinion said that this would now begin the process of making traditional views, if not illegal, at least viewed as immoral and bigoted. And so here now we have an example of this. Just because you hold a Christian view of the world, now you are no longer seen to be a fit citizen to serve on a jury. And I expect this kind of treatment to increase. This examples like this will become more frequent. That too is it's scary, it's sad, it's disappointing, but it is the natural outcome of the ideologies that have been that have insinuated themselves in our culture over the last 10, 15 years, especially.
What's that process? I've heard it before, where the first step is to the second step is to approve. Third step is it's like acceptance, approval, and then like participation or something like that. Have you heard that?
where you have to enthusiastically adopt and advocate for ideas that you previously rejected. So
they first sell it, right, with kind of this coexist of like, well, you can believe what you believe, but you have to also let them kind of believe and practice what they believe, right? And it's this kind of pluralism, yeah.
Yes.
But now they're moving it to the point to where you can no longer actually even believe and practice what was the original accepted idea, right? So the original idea was marriage is between a man and a woman, and the pitch was, well, you have to let this group of people do what they're doing, like, right, kind of this niceness, this pluralism. But now it's already moved to, now you can't even have that traditional view anymore. You have to have this alternative view, or else you will actually be now relegated to, as you said, second-class citizen.
Yes. And that will surface in many different venues. It is one of the things that surfaced in that hearing that we talked about earlier. The the folks that opposed the amendment that we were offering, that opposed offering a religious exemption again, they were very clear in saying that they no longer want to have this conversation where we try to balance the viewpoints of all the members of society. The idea that we would consciously try to be respectful of each other, even while disagreeing on the substance of issues. At least in a procedural way, we can be tolerate each other and speak in moderate tones and so forth. All of that is now being rejected. Yeah, and so that's the way we move from a tolerance to a coercion. Yeah, and we're getting a good taste of that right now, and I'm afraid it will only increase in intensity.
Once again, it's a good example of the mask being taken off. You know, you said what Supreme Court Justice Alito 2015 was able to see this, and that's, I think, just because he understands reality. And another good data point would be Timothy Keller's The Reason for God. And in that book, he starts off with what he thinks is kind of the most the biggest misunderstanding. And it's this approach of the inclusivity of all religions. And, you know, it basically goes, this is written, maybe 2005, something like that. Right. And he says the prominent idea in New York City is that all religions really believe the same thing. And that when any one religion claims that it's right, that's exclusive. But the inclusive thing is to say, we all have to we have to stop with these exclusive claims, if that makes sense. So for instance, he'll use the example of the blind man and the elephant, which is usually used by the other side, where it's, you know, you've got 5 blind men and they see an elephant and one grabs the trunk, one grabs the tail, you know, one grabs an ear, something like that. And each one thinks then the one that grabs the trunk says this is like a snake. The one that grabs the leg says, oh, this is like a tree, right? So the idea is that's what religions are. So you've got maybe Buddhism, or let's say like paganism or Christianity. They're just grasping different parts of the truth.
Different body parts of God.
Yeah. So, but they're all, you know, they're all partly right, but no one's exclusively right. And the idea then is that we just all have to get along and stop claiming that you have the real truth. And then Keller's whole point is to say, okay, well, the person that's using this example is claiming that they're the one person who is not blind, right? So they're being just as exclusive in saying, I, the secularist, am the only person who really has the truth, right? Exactly. I'm the one that has the truth, not your religions. And in the book, because I'm teaching this we're trying to teach this to the 12th graders at Mayor Lutheran High School, because I'm subbing in their first semester. And it was definitely one that was very difficult for them to wrap their minds around. I don't think I succeeded in kind of implanting what Keller was trying to teach, because it's very foreign. They're already subjectivized in their minds by the world they live in to some degree. And I hope they'll come out of that, you know, through their educational process. But the example you just gave is a perfect example of that, right? Where the first pitch is we Christians, you can't just push your truth. You have to say there's a lot of truths. But in the end, what do? They're being even more exclusive than the Christians started off and saying, we're not even going to have this conversation with you anymore. No. We've got the truth and you Christians are dead wrong. And in fact, you guys don't even belong at the table for judicial systems, right? No. They've shown their hand that the first claim for inclusivity is really overt exclusivity.
That's right. And, you know, once they have made the case that they want to be allowed into the institution of marriage, then it's a very short period of time until it becomes obvious that the reason they want to be included is so that they can destroy that institution from within. Yeah. And the same thing is true of the various gender identity folks. The kids that I mentioned earlier that I don't remember if that was on air or not, but we had some 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders listening to this hearing.
Okay, I think this was off tape. So
yeah. But the question that they came back with was, why would a transgender person want to be employed, let's say, at a Lutheran school, where clearly their beliefs do not mesh with the beliefs of the school, the institution? But that is exactly the point, because once you are invited inside that institution, it's a very easy thing to then corrupt it from within. It's happening in Roman Catholicism. They've been very tolerant of folks that hold very, you'd have to call them heretical views. They've allowed them to exist and now have found their way up the clerical chain, the hierarchy, and we're finding what that produces, a Catholic Church that is in crisis.
Yeah.
And the same thing will be true of all the other institutions that are in the process of being infiltrated.
Yeah.
And
it is the Trojan horse, isn't it?
It is. It very much is. And so we have to be alert to that and to resist it, particularly early on in the process. And as far as we're concerned, the Minnesota Human Rights Act that we talked about earlier is the place where we have to take a stand.
Yeah,
because it is once that is corrupted, once we lose the religious accommodations that used to be applied to all protected classes, then we have lost that. And again, government becomes weaponized against people of faith.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that image again of we've been under attack. We've been going back, right? They've been gaining ground. And at some point, the first thing you have to do is to, at some point, halt.
To stop backing up.
Before you can start moving forward again.
Yes.
And that time was probably a couple of years ago where we should have done it. But either way, you can't go back in time. But we do, at least now, so at some point, we need to stop this.
I mean, there are some within our culture that are beginning to recognize the degree of harm that has already been caused.
Yeah.
Sociologists, psychologists.
Jordan Peterson, for instance.
Jordan Peterson would be a good example of that. He's not a particularly religious person, at least that he will admit to.
He's got a strong interest in it, but he's not. Live as if there's a God.
But those people, especially those that you might call classic liberals, they are beginning to get a clarity of vision, which sees the degree to which our culture is in a world of hurt.
Yeah, who's the British actor? Popular guy. He's been big in the podcast realm recently. He's a comedian. No, not Ricky Gervais, although he kind of did a little bit. He's got kind of longer hair. Yes, Russell Brand. Like, he's a great example of that, of someone who was, because he's fully liberal. Like, historically, he's very liberal, like, hyper. And he just kind of slowly started questioning some of those liberal things, moved to the middle. And now he's on the other side where he's ringing the bells too and saying, this is insane. And he's now fully standing against it. And that gives him he's extra potent because he was on that side. So he's got an in. People on that side respect and they listen to him. To whereas if you send like Rush Limbaugh, hey, rest in peace over there, they're going to say, I don't want to listen to Rush Limbaugh, but they'll listen to Rush Limbaugh and they'll listen to Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan's had a similar path of same thing. Joe Rogan is not a Christian by any means, but even I was watching something at one point and he was talking with like a very non-Christian individual again, and they were talking about abortion. And they were just appalled at third trimester abortion. And they kind of stopped there, but you could tell they weren't thinking about it philosophically or theologically. They were just like, that's really messed up, right? And they were just speaking very plainly on that. And there is kind of an awakening to some degree.
And, in terms of the optimism that we referenced a little bit earlier, I am optimistic that not only that things will begin to turn, but have already begun to turn. You can only insult reality so long, before it begins to impose itself on all of us. And so I believe that from people who have not viewed themselves as part of the church, that they will begin, even from a natural law perspective, begin to see that there is wisdom. And one hopes and prays that will, continue to be not just an earthly wisdom, but that they'll be open to the claims of the gospel as well.
It's almost like a reversal of Romans 1, isn't it? Because that's, of course, where like once you forget God, then you start to forget even like the natural order, and you end up in insanity.
Dark places, yeah.
And I wonder if there's almost kind of like a reverse to where you can see someone like Russell Brand, for instance, is coming out of the chaos. He's recognizing the order of nature and saying this is contra nature. And like that's on the pathway of saying, well, what has to be the objectivity behind nature, and eventually kind of getting to that Jordan Peterson place where he's like, well, maybe there's got to be some kind of objectivity behind. He's not quite yet ready to call it God. And then once you call it God, then
that's right.
Then you can move to Christianity. So it is kind of a pulling out of the darkness.
Yeah. As people recognize that if you want true freedom, and that is what most people want, true freedom can be found only where there is order. And so as we descend further into this chaos, and people begin to feel the great discomfort that comes with no rules, no boundaries, no nothing, they, I believe, will instinctually want to move back toward a more ordered form of life. And guess what? The Christian faith has that to offer in spades. And so, again, I'm optimistic that this dark time is going to give way to a much brighter future.
Yeah, I am too. What was I know you had one more. That was interesting.
Well,
there.
one of the bills that also has been reintroduced into the Minnesota legislature this year has been a bill that would limit the speech of state certified therapists. So psychologists and so forth, people that offer speech counseling to people who have various issues. One of the issues that people sometimes approach a counselor with is if they have same-sex attraction that they wish they didn't have, that they will approach a counselor, therapist, and ask them to help them with that. Or if they have gender dysphoria issues and they recognize that this is not making them happy, that their life is there's turmoil there, and they'll approach a therapist and say, help me work my way through this. I don't want to feel like I'm in the wrong body. So this legislation would say that any therapist that would help a minor, now we're just talking about minors here, that would help a minor overcome homosexual feelings, or that would help a gender dysphoric person come to terms with and be happy with the body that they inhabit, that would be illegal. Well, it would be a violation of their professional ethics. And on that basis, they could have their license removed and effectively lose their livelihood. So that has been brought before the Minnesota legislature in previous years. It has not gone anywhere, but it's back again with a renewed push. We're still hopeful that we can stop that, but given the militancy of the Democratic side, they may be able to push that through. So that will be an assault not so much on religious liberty rights as on free speech.
Yeah.
The good news is there have been other parts of the country that have gone down this road. One of the appellate courts, I believe it was the 11th Circuit, has already ruled that this is a violation of the Constitution to limit the speech of therapists to essentially just voicing one side of an issue. So even if it were to pass, I think there's a fair chance that it would not stand a constitutional test.
Yeah. What about that other one we talked about? Would that the transgender one, right, where they've removed the religious, the one we were talking about earlier, where like a church would be forced to hire someone who's transgender.
Yes.
If that makes it all the way up, is that going to live, or do you think there's a good chance that some cooler head will prevail and knock that down?
Well, it depends to some degree on whether it's pursued in a federal court or in a state court.
Okay.
In a federal court, there are already some pretty robust protections against that kind of an assault on religion.
Mm-hmm.
State courts don't have quite that same degree of protection, although there are some aspects of state statute as well as constitutionally that would likely render that unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't want to risk it if we don't have to.
Yeah. Okay. So it is good that there's some, at least on the federal side, there's some safeguards, but states can still run rampant, right? Like states can still be very destructive.
I mean, that's the one area in our public life, particularly on the federal level, where sanity has largely prevailed.
Mm-hmm.
Largely. And that is in the federal judiciary and especially at the Supreme Court
Mm-hmm.
level. Having said that, they're human beings like the rest of us and open to all kinds of influence and pressures.
It's not a good long-term plan where you have to always go back to the very last line of defense for survival. Right?
Exactly.
You hopefully don't have to use that in that way.
That's right.
So in this bill you're talking about, what would that do for, so am I understanding that right? The thing that would be at risk for the psychiatrist or the psychologist would be their licensure. So therefore this would not apply to like a pastor. If a child comes to a pastor and wants counseling for this, we would not be at risk underneath this law because I'm not certified. So there's nothing that the state can pull from me. Is that right?
Well, probably. There's some hesitation there because the state does impose some control even over pastors. You, for example, are a mandatory reporter
Mm-hmm.
Under state statute.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some areas in which the state does claim jurisdiction over you
Mm-hmm.
as a pastor. More than likely, they would not be able to do anything that would punish you if you gave counseling to a minor who is wrestling with one of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
But again, there's a good deal of ambiguity, and when it comes before a particular judge in a particular jurisdiction at a particular time, I would hesitate to say that there's any guarantee there.
Yeah. Once again, the nose is underneath the camel's nose is underneath the tent.
Yeah. So, in the past, we've had multiple lines of defense
Mm-hmm.
on these things. Those lines of defense are thinning
Mm-hmm.
and in some cases disappearing. And that's why everybody needs to be aware
Mm-hmm.
of what's happening so that we, in our conversation with our neighbors, we can lift up and call people's attention to the direction things are going. In a political year, they're all political these days, but in an election year like this one, to be actively engaged in the political process.
Mm-hmm.
The two major parties are not the same when it comes to the issues that we've been discussing.
Mm-hmm.
One of them clearly is in greater alignment with the church and its view of the human person and a Christian worldview
Mm-hmm.
than is the other.
Yeah.
And so you need to make choices. And unless you decide to simply withdraw from the culture and not be engaged, not vote, in the end, frequently you have to choose between the lesser of two imperfect things.
Yeah.
So that calls on everybody
Mm-hmm.
to remain engaged, to stay informed, so that when it comes time to make these prudential judgments, these distinctions between good and better, that we're able to do that. And then obviously, when it comes to voting, we need to be there to vote, to encourage others to do the same. And it's a time to be engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you answered. I was going to ask two more questions, and I think you answered the first one. I was going to ask to kind of keep on this kind of like warlike imagery. If we're on the defense, what's the defensive strategy to kind of halt and stop moving backwards? And then what is the offensive strategy of here are the things that we can start to do to rectify and remedy what's been going on?
So the most immediate action that needs to happen in terms of halting the onslaught is to be contacting legislators, even before we get to the election later this year. Whether your legislator is on the progressive side or on a more traditional conservative Christian perspective, they all need to hear from us. On the conservative side, they need to be supported because it's a very lonely place in St. Paul or in Washington. And as you indicated earlier, when you're in a committee hearing and the other side has hordes of people and there's really nobody to speak from your perspective, it's hard to resist capitulating in that. So contact your legislator, be engaged in the political process.
Real quick, when you say contact, would you recommend like a phone call? Would you recommend an email? Like what are potent ways to do that?
Yeah. Well, the gold standard is to call your legislator up and say, would you meet with me? It's that face-to-face interaction, particularly with representatives, because they have a lot fewer number of people that they're responsible for. But even senators ask to meet with them. And most of the time, they'll be happy to do that, even if they represent a political philosophy that's different than yours. So that would be the first. A handwritten letter is probably the next most valuable thing to do.
Okay.
After that would
do you think they read those?
Yes.
They do? Yeah.
Because they get so few.
Okay.
They get very few. And so I've heard many legislators say to have one letter like that in hand is probably worth 1,000 emails that has come in. But having said that, if you only have time to do an email or to phone your legislator's office, do that. And that still is important. And then, of course, simply voting, being active in supporting candidates that you believe are going to support your view of human flourishing. What does it take to be a good society? They need support, not just with your vote, but with your dollars. Even if you're uncomfortable with that, it needs to happen. We've never been in a circumstance like this before. In our lived existence, never been anything like this. I suppose you could make the case for, back at the time of the Civil War, there were, tensions that were at least as high as this, but nothing in our lived existence. So now's the time. If you're not going to act now, you probably won't have the opportunity to 5 years or 10 years from now.
Yeah. And then on the offensive, what are some short-term victories we can have that would start to make a big difference?
The biggest offensive thing we can do is to find a way to remove our children from the educational sphere that
indoctrination
that the government has put there. The system of indoctrination that is the public school system today. Now, that'll be a shocking thing to hear for some people. The public school system has changed radically, particularly in the last 10, 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Although I will say at its core, the public school system is based on the idea that the most important thing in the lives of people, their view of God, their view of where I came from, where I'm going to, when that is out of bounds in a system, which it has been in public education, that of necessity is at best an incomplete education. Mm-hmm. At worst, it's something that distorts the world. Mm-hmm. So we need to find a way to empower parents so that they can freely choose the educational setting that their children are in. Mm-hmm. That choice must include religious education as well as secular. We need both. Mm-hmm. Parents will choose both, but the government needs to take its thumb off the scale in terms of pushing parents one way or another. Mm-hmm. Right now, clearly, it has its thumb on the scale in terms of promoting the free education, the government education program. We need to have a system of education savings accounts that gets that governmental thumb off the scale. Mm-hmm. And empowers parents, tells parents that they're important, mm-hmm. that they need to invest themselves in their child's education. Right now, parents have no incentive to do that. Mm-hmm. When they are told what school they will go to, and then are told by that school that their input is not welcome. Yeah, that's the ultimate dissing of parents. Mm-hmm. So we need to find ways to empower parents, both those that want their kids in a religious setting and those who want their kids in a public school setting, but they want a better public school, mm-hmm. one that is responsive to them as parents.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's incredibly important. You can't be, I think you talked before, maybe it was off in our break, but you can't push against the natural order forever, right? And when you have kids that are kind of underneath this idea that maybe I'm, of a different gender, of a different animal, something like that, these are not sustainable ideas. And if you the only way that lives is if it's continually fed by something. And that something is the public education system. And it's also what they're getting from their friends in a place like that. But then it's being supported, by the school.
The culture as a whole.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I've always thought, like, if my children ever get any of these crazy ideas, I've already had this conversation with myself. I've had my conversation with my wife. I will immediately go to the church and I'll say, listen, I need whatever it is, probably 2 months minimum. I need 3 months off. To be honest, like if that means I lose my job, I have to go, and I'm going to take my kids and we're going to go to wherever. We're going to go to Colorado. We're going to go up to Banff National Park, and we're going to take 2 months. If I have to burn through our savings, I don't care. We're going to go there and we're just going to be disconnected from everything. And I fully believe that if my kids have become, for whatever reason, indoctrinated with an unhealthy idea, if you just remove them from what they're being fed, just being in nature, just living normally, you'll autocorrect to some degree.
Which, of course, is the big attraction for homeschooling, where you're able to do that to a much greater degree than when you're sending the kids off to some other place for, large, significant number of hours every 5 days a week. Yeah. So, in the end, as I've said before, I'm optimistic. Mm-hmm. I'm optimistic because I think people are becoming more aware of what's going on. I'm going to do everything I can to make them even more aware, even when it's shocking. And the Lord in the end will use our humble efforts to bring about good things. Yeah. And let's get on with it.
Let's get on with it. Pastor Fred Hinz, thank you very much. This was great, and we'll have you back on again.
Thanks. Pleasure.
Yep. God bless you.
Thanks.